On behalf of the Kansas Department of Agriculture, good afternoon to those logged in, and thank you for joining our webinar. My name is Ben Lancaster, and I'm the Northeast and Southeast AFI Inspector for the AFI program. During the presentation portion of the webinar, all participant microphones will be muted. If you have a question during the presentation, please submit your question using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Submitted questions and comments will be monitored by the Kansas Department of Agriculture staff. At any time during the webinar, when asking a question, please include your name, city, and facility, business or nonprofit organization, if applicable, so that we may easily answer your question. This webinar will be recorded and will be posted online for all participants. As much as possible, the presentations will also be posted online. Please note that this presentation will be recorded today. It is with great pleasure we welcome Andrew Campbell. Mr. Campbell is an expert on family violence and the associated risks of harm for adults, children, and animal companions residing in homes where violence occurs. Utilizing data analysis, cross-discipline collaborations, and a personal perspective as a victim in childhood on violence in the home, he provides education for agencies around the globe and assists in developing more efficient and effective community responses to physical and emotional violence. Mr. Campbell's several recent publications in major academic journals include his analysis of nearly 10,000 first responder reports and observations from the scene of domestic violence incidents, and are among the first in academic literature to use law enforcement data to quantify risk of harm or injury in homes where domestic violence and pet abuse co-occur. Let us welcome Mr. Andrew Campbell.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm getting my slides up here, and then we're going to jump right into this. Let's see if we're good here. Okay. These topics are ones that I feel very passionately about for reasons that we'll get into as we go on. But I always want to note and add, obviously, most, if not all of you work in this field, you know, you're used to seeing these types of things, but I always want to give a disclaimer at the start. I talk about family violence all over the country and now in other countries as well. And there seems to be something that is particularly emotionally difficult when we bring in the pet piece. I think so many of us can relate to pets and have such good memories with animal companions that there's something particularly that can be even more so than other areas of family violence that can affect us. So again, if you need to take a moment, there's, you know, step away, do whatever you need to do there. I'm not going to be intentionally cruel, but I will speak truth today. I'm going to share my own personal story as well as other victim accounts. And so I just wanted to start with that. But again, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. My work as a researcher here out of Indianapolis, Indiana, is all aimed at reducing family violence, improving our reaction and response to it. Today, we're going to look specifically at the pet piece of family violence and how that's related to other forms of family violence and the importance of the work of animal welfare professionals, and not only in better protecting animals in these homes, but the humans who reside there as well. So often asked why family violence. It's professional. I'm a published author. I just actually wrote a book on the topic we're talking about today. It'll be out in September. I've published 10 academic papers in the last 13 months. I speak a lot. I do a lot of academic work, but not just professional. This is also personal. You see the photo of me there. I grew up in a home where instant partner violence occurred. At 14, I woke up to my mom crying, screaming on the floor. My dad standing there. I picked her up and I said at 14, you know, if you will not let him back in this home, I won't leave you. I'll figure out whatever I need to do. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll take care of you and my then 6-year-old sister. I will not go anywhere. Just do not let him back. She kept her word and I kept mine. And then took about 13 years before I felt comfortable leaving the home. And unfortunately, I had to grow up much quicker than I would have wanted to, as many kids in these types of home environments do. But you see the dog there, that's who got me through, Shelby. saved my life over and over again. I mean, the stress and because even after my dad left, the harm continued, as we often see to be the case. But it was the still steady voice of that dog, a terrier mutt, as I said, named Shelby, that the 17 years I had him, he just breathed life into me. And his influence and his impact, I could not put into words. You know, I don't know where I would be today if not for him, but I certainly wouldn't be here. As I would get older, I would contemplate suicide many times, and it was still always that steady voice of my dog that kept me going. The reality of the toxic stress exposure for those 10 to 12 years of just really significant stress is that I have observable brain changes myself through MRI. I actually used to work at a children's hospital early on in this work and volunteered for an MRI. They needed it for, I don't think they were testing the science of the equipment, hopefully not, but testing the process. And in the course of that MRI, they discovered significant changes myself to my brain. It's why I speak as often as I can. I'm averaging speaking about every week or every week and a half. I am noticing some cognition and some of those things kind of changing. So again, I treat every talk like it's my last, not to be over dramatic, but I know it's a blessing to be able to speak out for victims in this area. And I take every talk, again, like it were to be my last. So I probably have more slides today than we'll get to, but I'll send you the full slide deck upon completion. Again, the other unfair thing, when we think about stress and we think about the children in particular who are experiencing this stress in these homes, you know, it's unfair. It steals their childhood, and we forget sometimes, though, that it also shortens their adult life too. And so the idea that, you know, my life will be shortened and I'll likely lose time with my precious children, you know, is more than I can bear, and it's unfair. So the speaking is actually a big part of my healing. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to do this today. When we think about family violence, and I define family violence as abuse or violence that occurs in the home, can be physical, sexual, or emotional. And I usually look at partner violence, or partner abuse, child abuse, pet abuse, and elder abuse, thinking of those, again, those types of violence and things that occur in the home. When we think about most prevention initiatives, they generally focus on the adult. They're on the right. And again, we know that obviously adults are significantly impacted by domestic violence and partner abuse, but we see sometimes less often the focus on pets and children in the home. And these two are key players. I often say, you know, I don't think you can best help anyone in this photo if you're not helping them all. We have to view this group as a team. And again, you've got to help them all and protect them all if you want to help and protect any of them. You see the adult victim there pictured as a woman. We know men are victimized as well. We know this type of abuse occurs in same-sex relationships as well. But when we add the pet piece, particularly when we're talking about partner violence, at least in what's reported in my research, it's overwhelmingly more common to be a female victim and a male perpetrator. We're looking at about 96, 97%, again, based on my data and research. So again, I acknowledge it can be a man. You see it pictured as a female there, just because we often see it that way when we add in this pet piece. As I said, the pets and children are often key players in homes when partner abuse and domestic violence occurs. Pets actually reside in 80% of the homes in the US where partner abuse occurs. And children reside in at least 60%. That number has been kind of estimated. One of my recent studies put it at about 60, could be even higher. But again, we know children and pets are often present in homes where domestic violence and partner abuse occurs. Some real life accounts here from victims that kind of describe, with an emphasis on the pet piece today. Like I said, I focus largely on the child pet piece, also acknowledging the importance of the adult piece. But these are victim quotes and survivor quotes. It wasn't until I told him I was leaving that it began to target my children and cats. And we see this common. I see this come up wherever I am working in the country with different agencies, of this idea of abusers describe targeting pets as a means of kind of changing things up in the home. You know, they may be at greater risk to do this if they fear that the victim is about to report the abuse, about to end the relationship, about to leave the home. But we see them begin to target the pets sometimes as a means to kind of change and kind of increase their grip or their feelings of control in the home. He said if I left, it would be a death sentence for my beagle. My kids love that dog so much, and I knew he would kill it if I left. So I stayed for 5 more years. Just heartbreaking to think about. Again, my work with law enforcement data, looking at domestic violence cases and reports, indicates that in many of these homes where domestic violence, particularly when it's of a violent physical nature, occurs more than once a week. So again, you're talking about 5 years. We're talking about a considerable number of events. Not only are all in the home at risk of being emotionally harmed, but physically harmed or even killed, right? When we're thinking about that nature. In this particular community, the resources that were in place did not account for pets in the home. And so again, the victim was forced with this terrible decision of leaving their pets behind, knowing that they would likely be killed by the perpetrator or remaining in the home. We see victims faced with that same decision, unfortunately, all over the country, around the world. And many times they choose to do just this, stay in that home, or they'll choose to go homeless and live in their car. Again, heartbreaking decision-making that many of them have to make. The cats are completely different now that we have them. I remember how skittish they were in her home. It's as if they were absorbing the fear and stress my daughter was experiencing. These are the heartbreaking words of a father who actually lost 2 daughters in an intimate partner violence homicide. The perpetrator killed his partner, and the sister had actually just showed up at the home, and he killed her too. But the dad's here describing going over to their house, and he said things felt a little off with the boyfriend, but he never had any idea really, what later came to light. The sister had actually been one that had kind of spotted things. I think that's probably partially why he killed her too. But he said, that when we were in their home and visiting them, the cats would be kind of just acted very weird for cats. They just seemed extremely skittish. They seemed even more so than you normally would from a cat, avoidance of human contact. He said we used to make fun of them because they just acted so awkwardly. And he said, now that we have them and they're safe, they act as I would expect cats to act. They're acting more calm, more normal. They're more engaged with humans. And I'm remembering they were trying to tell me something, or I'm realizing they were trying to tell me something is what he said. They were absorbing the fear that my daughter experienced when we weren't there. And they were behaviorally showing that through their actions. We see that to be the case. Unfortunately, we do see animals absorbing the fear and stress and harm of the humans they love, particularly when that abuse occurs in the context of partner abuse and violence. Again, our focus today, we know all 3 are important, is largely on the pet-child piece. In a single word, pets are family. 95 to 98% of Americans in recent polls have indicated they consider the pet to be a part of the family. I don't know what was wrong with the other 2 to 5% if they didn't understand the question or if they were having a bad day. But pets are absolutely part of the family. Unfortunately, we rarely see them included in family violence type prevention initiatives, which is again a big part of my work, trying to draw awareness to that. But again, Americans and many other countries too, individuals consider pets to be part of the family. When we think about pets in America, 68% just in general of US homes have at least one pet. As I said, they're actually even more likely to be in homes where domestic violence occurs. So then the number jumps up to 80% based on research and what's available in the literature. When we're talking pets in homes where domestic violence occurs, more than half the time we're talking a dog. We also see cats. But again, in my work, and again, for sake of time, it's going to be a whirlwind today. I'm throwing a lot at you. Again, that's why I'll share some of the slides. I'm also going to share some of my studies with you too, so you can read through those if you have interest. But again, I know I'm throwing a lot at you today in a short period of time. But it's most commonly dogs, and then second, cats. But if we think about why pets are targeted in homes when family violence occurs, and many times we'll get into it as we go on, but I think a lot of it's what these pets provide for the victims in the home, right? If you're a perpetrator of family violence, a perpetrator of abuse, the last thing you want are victims feeling hope. The idea that they can get out, that they have support, right? We know it's a key aspect that perpetrators often use in terms of family violence is isolation. So if we think of this as being pets are targeted, obviously they're vulnerable too, but if they're targeted because of what they provide for victims, it would mean any pet could be at risk. So even though we see dogs and cats, we think of more rural environments, we think of horses, we think of livestock, we think of chickens, we think of any sort of animal that the victim can potentially share that bond with, again, creating risk for that animal as being targeted. One of my recent studies, this was in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, and it's actually become the most shared study ever published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence. It's the top 1% of any study published in any journal in terms of tracking shares. Was among the first to utilize law enforcement reports and of domestic violence, and particularly look at that overlap of pet abuse. So we're talking domestic violence perpetrators who also have a history of abusing pets in the home. This was, I analyzed nearly 10,000 cases out of Indianapolis, and again, focused on the pet piece. I will say when I started all this work, again, I shared my personal story, but when I started all of this, I wanted to, after my own personal experience, obviously, I wanted to create as much difference as I could in this field. I didn't set out to focus on pets, but as I got deeper and deeper into the research, it became so obvious that I couldn't do good in this field without focusing on pets. I mean, it just became so obvious to me. And so that this was actually a follow-up study to an earlier one, but we're going to get into some of the findings now of what I discovered. One of the things that came from this was this idea of a family violence timeline. And so again, this is from looking through all these reports. It doesn't mean family violence always goes in this sequence, but it was something I noted in doing this work and in analyzing all these reports. And you see kind of the cycle through here of examples of a single household and the violence and abuse that occurs. Now, on average, what I noted is on the 10th incident, just in general, intimate partner violence is occurring in a home. On the 10th incident, the family, if they're going to report, will report to law enforcement. So again, I think this speaks to why I often hear law enforcement agencies describing, or many other agencies too, this idea of feeling like you're behind the 8 ball from the get-go. This speaks to that. If victims are already experiencing 10 incidents before they call, again, we already see this cycle of violence well on its way. What's extremely, I mean, that's alarming, but what even more alarming is when the abuser, and we're talking about domestic violence, partner abuser, when they also abuse pets in the home, victims will wait even longer. And again, I said these perpetrators often use these threats to pets to delay that report. So again, just in general, 10 incidents, call police for DV. When there's pet abuse in the home, the victim will wait till they've experienced 20 to 50. So again, we're talking about this period of critical delay where, in my opinion, children, pets are at great risk, right? This is when the perpetrator knows that the victim is considering reporting, ending the relationship, and they begin to more actively target children and pets as a means to control that victim and keep them from making the call. It's usually, unfortunately, very effective, right? I think back to my own situation, and my fear was always of something happening to my mom, right? The offender in my case presented a great emotional risk to me, but I was always worried he would kill my mom. Throughout my teens and early 20s, I did not sleep. I'd be up checking doors, checking windows, and perpetrators know that. They know that often with victims in these homes that threatening others can even affect them more than threatening them themselves. So again, when we think about family violence, we're worried about every incident. The next incident can always be fatal. Every incident creates harm. But there seems to be something particularly concerning when pet abuse is occurring, that delayed call. And right, we're already concerned when there's been 10 incidents that a cycle has started. Now imagine 20 to 50, right? Trying to work with children, trying to work with adults after they've already witnessed 20 to 50. Not impossible, but very difficult. We often see research citing, the highest risk for adult victims is when they seek shelter. And that's true when it comes to homicide. But again, I look at this period of critical delay, incidents 11 to 20 or 11 to 50 before the 911 call comes in, as being a time of high risk for children and pets in these homes. When we think about, again, as I said, just it became so obvious to me. I didn't set out in this work to just focus on the pet abuse piece, but when I was looking at different characteristics of these police reports for domestic violence, there seemed to be no single characteristic that spiked risk in so many ways than an offender history of harming animals too. So we're talking, again, DV offender also harms pets in the home. Just in general, IPV victims reported, about 8% of them reported a history of rape in a relationship. Just knowing one thing, that the suspect also harms pets, and we see 26% of victims now reporting this history of forced sex or rape. So again, almost or greater than a tripling. When we look at things such as strangulation, again, we know strangulation is tied to homicide risk and many other concerns there. 47% in general in Indianapolis. And again, my N value was nearly 10,000 cases I looked at. We're already worried about that. National averages are kind of close to, kind of put this rate at closer to 20 to 30%. So already elevated in my city, just in general. Add in the pet pet abuse piece, and now we're looking at 76% of victims. So we're worried with 47, but it's just mind blowing when we get to 76. So again, domestic violence occurring, perpetrator also harms animals. You can almost bank on there being a strangulation attempt in that home. Very alarming to think about. When we think about toxic stress, I alluded to the effects on myself, and we know, again, I give an hour, 90-minute talk just on this topic. It's quite, I look at toxic stress and emotional abuse as often being kind of the silent killer in these homes. Again, it may occur over time, but it's almost always life shortening, the exposure to it. But when we think about controlling daily activity, most victims report this as meaning you can't go anywhere, can't do anything without the perpetrator's permission. 55% in general, add in the pet abuse piece, history of pet abuse, now we're at 84%. Victim lives with daily fear they will be killed. 35% are already worried about, look, almost 80%. Again, we just know one thing, right? We don't often, some agencies do. I think I've actually given presentations in the state of Kansas before, and I know some communities, law enforcement, when they're responding to domestic violence, ask about animal abuse. Absolutely a question they need to be if they aren't already. I'd be asking it in the first 5 questions because, again, an affirmative answer spikes risk in so many ways. This daily fear of death is important too. Obviously quite concerning, but important when we think from a mental health aspect, because PTSD, which we're obviously very worried about in this population, is often tied in research to the extent of time you fear for your life in terms of severe PTSD. So again, living with daily fear you will be killed. We know it's almost always the case in these homes. Again, very high risk for that severe PTSD symptomology. I'm going to focus a little bit now on the child pet bond piece. Again, I know we're short on time. Some of you're getting about 6 different talks that I've kind of shoved together. So I appreciate your time and attention. I'm going to speak for about another 15 or 16 minutes. And then turn it over for questions. But we're going to focus our next piece on the child pet bond. Again, as I said, it was my dog who saved my life. When we think about why pets are important in these homes, for many reasons. And again, I want to add, I often talk about protecting pets to protect people, but the pets obviously deserve to be protected for themselves as well. And so I want to make sure that's clear that just in itself, these animals deserve to be protected. But I often talk about too, what they provide for humans. So if you think back to your own pets and animals you've had in the home, right? And you think about things they provided, this is just a short list, but they provide so much, right? They provide so much often. And again, they may look different in more rural environments. They may not be dogs and cats, it may be livestock, it may be other types of animals. But they provide a great deal for humans in any home. But particularly when we think about the context of family violence, you see that list there. All these are critical components for emotional health and well-being. Children in particular, these pets may be their best chance at that list. Sad to think about, but true. I think about my own environment, my own situation. I have just a tremendous mother, a wonderful mom. But again, when we think about adult victims of abuse, we think obviously the perpetrator is unlikely to be a secure attachment for the children. The victim may want to be, but may just have nothing left. These perpetrators take so much from them mentally and emotionally that often they don't have enough left for the children in the home. And in that case, we see children being more likely to securely attach to animals in the home. So again, when you think about what pets provide, they provide a great deal. Much more than even on this list. But unfortunately, this may be exactly why they're targeted by perps. Again, when they think about the idea that they're giving hope, that they're giving this sense of comfort, it may be why they're targeted. Children are significantly impacted when animals are harmed in these homes. Here's a study you see listed there with some examples of accounts. My dad last week said that he was very upset with my mother and that he was going to burn the bird's wings with a lighter. That day that my dad said he would burn my dog on the grill, I took him into my room and locked him in the closet with food and water until the next day. My dog always sleeps with me in my room so that my dad doesn't hurt him. Again, just heartbreaking to think about the emotional harm, right? Again, we think about pets likely being everything to kids in these homes. And when these pets are threatened, it at times can be even more damaging for the child than if they were to receive the threat themselves. You see the bottom quote there, yellow. It's because it reminds me of a story I heard here in my own state of Indiana, where a child was falling asleep in the classroom, was getting in trouble for it, teachers, counselors were probably appropriately assuming, and the child was a teenager, that the child was staying up too late playing video games, watching TV, doing whatever, and falling asleep in the classroom. And the school counselor asked, well, why are you falling asleep? Why does this keep happening? The child said, well, I sleep with my German Shepherd, and the bed's not big enough for both of us. It's barely big enough for me, but you add in the German Shepherd, and there's just no way I can get any sleep. And so the counselor said, well, don't sleep with your dog. Then, then you'll be able to get sleep at night and at home. And the child said, well, you see, my dad hurts my mom. And he's told me that one day I'm going to wake up and my dog won't be there anymore. And so the only way I know he's going to be there in the morning is if I hold him through the night. Doesn't mean every child who's falling asleep in the classroom is experiencing this, but it was eye-opening for me and something I like to share because it should be at least something that we consider when we hear and think of those scenarios. The reality is that for some children, school is the only place they are safe. And so we do see children falling asleep and acting out in other ways because of that. Another heartbreaking aspect of this is that 75% of the time, pet abuse that occurs in the home is seen by children. Abusers, again, if they're using this act of pet abuse to try to harm everyone in the home as much as possible, right? They're going to want to go out of their way to make sure children see it. Again, trying to inflict as much harm as possible to make this as controlling a behavior as possible. And it sets a dangerous cycle in motion when this occurs. Anytime a child is abusing animals, we have to pay attention, right? We need to think about, what might they have experienced in the past? Has the child themselves been abused or neglected? Have they witnessed animal abuse? Because if we don't intervene, children who abuse animals are at very high risk, heightened risk, to go on to cause great harm in the home, both now and as they get older. As well as in the community and classroom. We see this history of children abusing and harming animals intentionally, again, being a significant red flag. We have to pay attention. And the younger the child is that's committing these acts, seems to kind of jumpstart the cycle. So again, we have to catch it early. We have to pay attention. It's nothing that should ever be ignored or downplayed when children are intentionally engaging in acts of animal abuse. On the extreme end of the way this can go, fortunately, it doesn't always go this way, but sometimes it does. So I share this. This is a police report. I'll just share a brief part of this for sake of time. At this time, he states he remembers his early family life as being one of extreme tension. He states the tension came from the relationship that existed at that time between his mother and his father. He stated although he was not physically or sexually abused and did not witness any physical abuse from his parents, that they were constantly at each other's throats and arguing. He states his mother appeared to have some psychiatric problems and suffered a nervous breakdown at one time during his early childhood. I'll go and stop it there. So again, this individual, and this was part of a 200-page confession that I read every word of, but the individual we're talking about describes this history of emotional harm, emotional abuse, emotional damage in childhood, never describes physical, sexual abuse, just that emotional piece. He also stated that during this time he was cutting up animals, he would fantasize what it would be like to cut up a human being. And what we're reading here is the confession of notorious U.S. serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. So not every child who experiences emotional abuse and then harms animals goes on to be a serial killer. Again, there'd be none of us left if that were the case. But we do see serial killers often, not always, but often having this history. When we think about a serial killer, we may think, well, they've been sexually abused, they've been physically abused, but we don't always see that. Again, I think we downplay emotional abuse, and wrongly so. Many of these individuals are significantly impacted by that emotional harm. There are many reasons why children abuse animals. For sake of time, I can't get into all those today. Heartbreaking, regardless of their reason. But we do see them in these scenarios often potentially starting with animals, moving on to humans and causing great harm there. And not just serial killers, we see this in the same history, not always. I think a very conservative study, and again, many times animal abuse reports are suppressed for many reasons. Communities may not keep accurate records. Most of the studies that explore this history of animal abuse and school shooters and community or perpetrators of mass violence rely on media reports. So again, any estimate in any study, I think, is an undercount. But even conservative numbers are that at least 40% of school shooters and mass murderers have a known history of abusing animals. And again, that's just known. So I would expect that number in reality to be much higher, but that's what's reported. When we think about school shooters and those who commit acts of mass violence, most commonly we see kind of a hands-on abuse. So whether it's strangulation or something severe, attacking or beating an animal with their hands, usually a dog or cat, and not always their own. Sometimes it's a neighbor or one from the neighborhood. But again, important to note, not all kids that abuse animals go on to do these types of things, but there is a significant number who do these types of things that have that as a history. I'm going to transition now into in our last 10 minutes or so of kind of a unique project that I'm engaged in currently, and an ongoing project. My knowledge is it's the only of its kind in the world in terms of looking at these issues from this perspective, but it's through spatial mapping. So I work with law enforcement agencies across the state of Indiana. I actually did one of these maps when I was in Dodge City in Kansas for their community as well. But exploring, just again, another angle, another way to look at these issues. So what you see here is domestic violence reports to law enforcement over a calendar year in Marion County, Indiana, and then a different data source, animal control runs during the same year. This is not a straight population map. We don't see the most dots in the area where we see the most people, even controlling for that. Pretty compelling when we look at law enforcement responding to DV in the pretty similar areas that we see animal control responding to animal related incidents. Looking at a different community in Indiana, in Fort Wayne up in Allen County, a DVE on the left, animal incidents on the right. Again, seeing this pretty compelling pattern, and again, controlling for population. And finally, the last county I'll share, this is Boone County in Indiana, and this is a kind of a mix, but more of a rural community than the other two. And again, seeing this pretty compelling pattern. Again, controlling for population, we still see this kind of compelling comparison of where DV is occurring and where animal control is getting reports. I think it speaks to the importance, again, of cross collaboration and strengthening these partnerships in our community. Another angle to what I just shared ties directly into COVID-19 and the current pandemic we're dealing with. I published each of these papers here. If you want to take a screenshot of that or take a photo of that, both of these are open access. So if you were to Google that title, you could download the whole paper for free. I also plan to send that in your materials so that you can read them. But these are two of my recent studies, both looking at the pandemic and how family violence was impacted. The one on the left was actually cited by the CDC in their recommendation to reopen schools, and it's been cited now in almost 500 academic studies. The one on the right I just wrote about a month ago. But each of these describe what I'm going to get into next, which when we look at that map, and again, thinking about the overlap, and it's important to note all the time, but particularly in the pandemic we're dealing with now. And that's because of how reporting was impacted during the pandemic. You know, there are many reasons why victims of family violence don't report, and many of those reasons were exacerbated during the pandemic. So here, this is from the second paper of the two I just shared. Looking at domestic violence reports to police, 2019 to 2020. I saw this in many communities. This one is in Bloomington, Indiana, but that dip in reports we had our severest lockdown from April to June. And in many communities, we saw that drop right in reports. I don't believe it means family violence stopped occurring at a time when risk was probably the highest, but we see reports suppressed and they're not coming in. You see that dip there, and look at the similar dip in child abuse reporting across the state of Indiana, again, during that same period of time, with 2020 representing, and again, that dip from March to May representing, or June, lockdown time. So again, we see these similar dips here from DV to child abuse. What we didn't see was that same dip in many communities when it came to animal abuse reporting. And again, as you've heard me speak throughout the course of this talk, we know there's a lot of overlap here. When animals are at risk, humans are. When humans are at risk, animals are. And so again, thinking back to my maps that show the overlap, in cases such as the pandemic, when being trapped with a perpetrator, being isolated or kept from schools and things like that, which are common report sources of child abuse, animal abuse may become our best chance at getting into many of these homes. And now in some communities, different types of animal abuse did come down, such as animals being left in hot cars, animals being left at home while the residents traveled. But again, not surprising. I would expect those numbers to come down because people weren't traveling and they weren't going out to the store as much. And so there wouldn't have been as much opportunity for that to happen. But again, looking at confiscations and what I consider more of severe cases where the animal is actually removed, we don't see that same dip. One of the big reasons for that is when we look at a report source. So when we're talking family violence in other forms, child abuse, elder abuse, and particularly partner abuse, I guess, so it kind of differs from child abuse to partner abuse. But partner abuse, it's almost always the adult victim themselves. 70 to 80% of the time calls the abuse in themselves. Only 8% of the time it's a neighbor. Almost always the victim themselves. Child abuse, children are often dependent on school teachers, on medical professionals, on law enforcement to report the abuse. What's different about pet abuse in my studies is 80% of the time, it's a neighbor or passerby who reports the abuse. So again, we think about lockdown scenario, human victims trapped in the home, no way out, limited opportunity for detection, high vulnerability. Pets still in the home, neighbors still having opportunity to detect. And in my opinion, that's why specific types of animal abuse and acts of animal cruelty were not as impacted during the lockdown, because our common report source was even more likely to be in the home and had potentially even greater opportunity to detect and report. So again, it's important always to explore, strengthen these collaborations, but even more so when we think about the pandemic conditions. For sake of time, I'm actually going to skip over this. This is another paper that I'll share. It's open access, but my most recent paper just came out a couple weeks ago. It's the first paper in literature to tie pet abuse perpetration to a risk for responders to domestic violence. So we've seen it tied to humans in the home. We've seen it tied to the community. This is the first paper in literature to tie it to a risk for police officers responding. So again, for sake of time, like I said, I know that I've only got a few more minutes left with you. I'll share these slides with you though, and I'll actually share the paper too, so you can read it if you have interest. But I want to wrap up. I don't just want to leave you with all these thoughts and not at least provide some sort of ideas in terms of where to go next. I always hate that when that happens. Someone paints a sad and dismal picture and then says good luck. I want to provide some of the ideas that I've seen in terms of improving our response to these types of things. The pandemic definitely showed us the need to expand our community partnerships, right? You know, these are major issues, obviously, that we deal with, and they're far too big for a single agency. When lockdown initiated in my community, child welfare kind of suspended some services, mental health services were suspended, schools were closed, churches closed, libraries closed, all these critical institutions to families that are vulnerable to abuse. But who didn't, you know, the agencies that didn't close was that the mail was continued to be delivered. We continue to see trash collectors in the community. Home repair continued, food pickup, food delivery. And so it became important to begin to think about expanding our partnerships to include these types of organizations. Again, I think during a pandemic and otherwise as well important. But thinking about the individuals that were still out in the community and still had a chance. Again, as I said, it's not like we have any of these issues completely figured out and family violence is going away. Makes sense to cast a wider net. Also the neighbor piece, as I said, 80% of neighbors or 80% of reports of pet abuse come from a neighbor or passerby. Only 8% of domestic violence. I know sometimes that abuse and violence can occur in closed doors, but it may be harder to detect. But at least in the case reviews that I do, there are an extensive number of incidents that would be quite loud and that you would feel that neighbors do in fact have some sort of knowledge of what's going on. So again, an area we need to focus on, you know, whether it's lockdown or not, this idea of encouraging neighbors to report and also making sure neighbors feel safe themselves to report these types of things going on. Much needed improved relationships when we think about family violence, whether it's DV, child abuse, other forms of this improved partnership with animal control and veterinarians. Just a critical community and organization to have at the table, in my opinion. We don't often see them in family violence prevention and intervention initiatives, but they are absolutely necessary for many of the reasons we described today. And the idea of, in particular, looking at the focus on animal welfare and child welfare, improving their work together. It's actually not a novel idea, but rather a return to our roots. Animal welfare efforts actually predated child welfare in terms of organized efforts in the US. Henry Berg started the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in 1866. And it wouldn't be for, I think about 8 years later that we saw the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children organized through Etta Wheeler and her work and concern over a child and her partnership with Henry Berg. So again, animal welfare actually predated child welfare in the US. And they were close. The child welfare at least started with a close partnership with animal welfare. I think we've kind of separated over time, but there's great need to renew and strengthen that. Again, pets provide so much. I think a pretty powerful piece of information that studies continue to show. I talked about the harmful effects of toxic stress and emotional abuse. Studies continue to show, and when I talk about that, I'm talking about the effects of cortisol, which is one of the hormones our body releases. We experience a stress response. Cortisol is released. So I should say with our stress response, our heart rate goes up, blood pressure goes up. Cortisol is the hormone our body releases to bring us back down. It's supposed to make sure that our heightened stress response is limited. In these homes, these children are experiencing constant stress, and this hormone is constantly going through their bloodstream and constantly causing harm to that. That's what created the harm in my own brain. Studies continue to show that pet dogs in particular have a calming effect and can actually act as a buffer to this stress response. It doesn't mean they take it away. In my case, like I said, I had a dog and it still was there, but they absolutely buffer it, even more so than the child's parents. So again, science actually indicates as well that pets can have a critical calming influence on children in these homes. Finishing up here in the last couple of slides, one other key area that we need to improve. Obviously, victims of IPV report significant concern for their pets. If they leave, as I said, they don't. If they feel that the home is dangerous enough that they have to leave, why would they feel safe leaving their dog behind or other pets? It's a major limiter of progress if families do get to shelter. I have many victims say, well, I couldn't even focus on healing because I was too worried about my dog or cat I had to leave behind. And many of them do return, right? It's just too much. I can think of another case where she said, you know, I finally made it to shelter. I should be safe. And they didn't allow me to bring my pets. And I just felt awful. I felt like if they died, it was going to be my fault. So I left the shelter in the middle of the night and went back to the abusive environment. When they can't bring their pets, they're not going to come. And if they do come, they probably won't stay. A recent survey found that 90% of victims of partner violence said a safe place to bring their pet would make it easier for them to leave. Again, we think of all the barriers to leaving, all the barriers to reporting, 90% we have to pay attention. That being said, still only 20% of US shelters accept pets on site. Now, fostering programs exist, and that's good. It's better than nothing. It still can separate victims from critical or from their animals at the time they need them most, right? If this pet is their emotional support, obviously a time of leaving your home and going to shelter, it's nice to know that you didn't have to leave the pet behind, but we're still separating these pairs that at the time they often need each other most. So again, something important to note, there's still many shelters out there that have nothing in place, and only about 20% that allow pets on site with humans in a shelter setting. As I said, it was my dog who saved my life. I would not be here if not for Shelby. And so my work is largely dedicated to him. I can remember nights at 14, 15, just feeling so stressed out, so overwhelmed. I had to get a job very quickly before I legally could. I worked 2 or 3 jobs, just completely overstressed, and it was not uncommon for me to be outside at 3 a.m. crying, upset, and nearly every night. I had such bad stomach aches and headaches, and I'd only eat a couple of days a week because of them. Not in good shape, but Shelby would sit out there with me, and some nights he would just lick the tears from my eyes. Other nights he would stand at the edge of the yard as if he was kind of watching guard, and as if to say, I've got this, you know, take a moment. I cannot put into words what that dog did for me. And I know that there are many Shelbys out there, whether it be a dog or other form of pet, doing the same types of things. So I appreciate all your work in this area and all your efforts to help your community. And again, we must protect pets because they deserve to be protected. But I also believe we can't best protect humans if we're not best protecting their pets and animal companions as well. Rare for me to ever give a talk that doesn't include at least 200 academic studies, including involving my own as well. There's a sampling of those. And here's some contact info that you can reach me at. Again, feel free to email me if you have questions. I've got some time now for some Q&A, but there's other ways to connect with me too there on social media. But again, thank you for your time and attention, and I'll go ahead and turn it over for questions now.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell, for that wonderful presentation. At this time, we'll turn it over to Dana Ladner from KDA. Dana, have there been questions submitted for our presentation?
There have been some excellent questions come through. One of the first ones I'd like to ask you, Andrew, is you talked about a lot of community partners. With that, are there states that have their animal control officers that are required to report suspected abuse to children, elders, disabled members of the household? From your research, do you know of any states are utilizing that piece as a community partner?
I know there are agreements in place in several communities that I've come across and working. I don't know if it's necessarily mandated by the state, the cross reporting. That's what I push for. I know that there's at least a few organizations that are pushing for similar types of things in their states. Have any of those come to pass yet? I'm not sure. They're absolutely necessary. I know, for instance, in my own community here in Indianapolis, there's an agreement. Well, obviously, everyone is a mandated reporter of child abuse here in Indiana, but there's an agreement between law enforcement and child services that if they come across a domestic violence scene, that children are present in the home, given the fact that data clearly indicates in statistics that 6 children that live in a home where DV occurs are at 60 times the risk. So they have an agreement that if children are in the home or are present or around the incident that they report it. They don't necessarily have that same agreement in my city with animal control, but again, it's something I'm pushing for. We know animals are often the most vulnerable member of the household. If children are at 60 times the risk, the risk for pets has to be even higher than that. So absolutely necessary. I know there are many communities that do it, that they have agreements in place, but nowhere near the reach that we should have. I think it's so obvious. Again, if pets are harmed in the home, we know the pets are at risk, but we also know that the humans are at great risk, and humans not just who reside there, humans who respond to any incidents in that home. And there's often a lot of other incidents occurring too, and the surrounding community. The risk is so great that I think it's absolutely necessary, and would love to see more communities do just that.
Thank you very much for that. You gave us a lot of research information from Indianapolis and some larger venues. So I want to think a little bit about the rural communities in our state. Giving all the statistics that show the link between human and animal violence, what are your feelings on law enforcement being reluctant to investigating animal cruelty complaints in rural communities?
So concerned. I'm actually writing a webinar on that very topic. I partner with the National Sheriff's Association. I do a number of webinars for them, the Justice Clearinghouse, each year. And my next one, looking at my calendar, I don't know if I have it up here. I think it's in September, but I'm actually writing one just on family violence in rural communities, and addressing some of those very barriers, because I think they're great. I was actually just appointed to a law enforcement committee, a national committee on that very issue too. I would have great concern. We think of barriers to reporting, barriers to detection in an urban environment, and many of those are great too. Spread it out in a rural environment, add in even greater isolation, even less accountability. I have no reason to believe that abuse and these types of issues aren't even more frequent there. You know, it's very hard to collect that data. Again, victims have to trust you to report, and it's not that you know, they don't do that, but in an extreme isolation, you know, it makes sense. I for a long time myself was outspoken in this work and a researcher, but never disclosed any of the things that happened in my own home. You know, even after I moved out, always out of fear of what would happen to my family, again, if I did so. And we know that risk and fear is probably even greater in these communities. So again, I think if animal incidents are occurring, we never want to ignore them. But again, and when we think about a more rural environment, it may be our only chance. Victims are even more likely to be in kind of a lockdown scenario. So if you're getting any kind of call and it's an animal related call, you have to take that seriously, and you have to truly evaluate the safety of the humans in that home as well. Again, thinking about lockdown conditions and the things I've described during the pandemic, in some cases, it may be our only chance to detect harm to humans in that home as well.
You talked at the end of your presentation about the reluctance to either going to a shelter as someone within the violence piece of this, and that they are more likely to leave when the pets are involved with that. What care is available for an animal if a person goes to a protective shelter?
So it changes and varies from community to community. Here in the U.S., organizations such as Red Rover are working to make more of these opportunities available. You can also look at the Animal Welfare Institute's website. They have a Safe Havens mapping project that shows in each state any shelters that have anything in place for pets. Like I said, it's 18 to 20% of shelters in the U.S. allow pets on site, so most don't. And those that don't, some of those have foster systems. And so this was actually out of the country, but I'm working with an organization in Canada that has an elaborate foster system set up that they have all these people who have volunteered beforehand to take on these animals. They have it all mapped out across the territory. And so that they, when someone seeks shelter, the animal immediately goes into protective custody in one of these homes that's already been vetted before. So they already know it's a safe environment, that's removed away from that area. So again, no less risk for the perpetrator to be able to find that animal. And the other important aspect when you're doing fostering, again, for children, like I said, children are extremely reliant on these pets for so many things. You can't just separate them and say that the pet is safe. They probably won't believe you, because if they've never been safe, they're still going to worry about that pet. So another key component, and this group does it, is ensuring safe communication continues, whether it's the form of photos or video of the pet to show that they're still safe. I've even seen some groups, even for younger children, write letters from the dog or pet to the child, just so that there's some sort of communication that continues. That can be important as well.
We had a question come in that's actually a step before going to a shelter, reporting, etc. So if a person is starting to think about leaving, as the question goes, are there places such as shelters that may offer help for families who want to get their pet to a safe situation before that next step occurs?
So before they leave the home, is that kind of so like before the humans leave, get the pet safe and then leave?
That is correct.
So the only thing, there probably are, but again, I would be concerned about risk, because it's kind of, when we think about risk of humans, particularly for the adult, of homicide, again, I think that critical delay period, the risk is great for children and pets, but for the adult human in the home, studies continue to show that risk of homicide is greatest when they are in the act of fleeing the home. And so moving the pet from the home would seem like something that would potentially tip off the perpetrator that something's going on and immediately spike that risk. So I know there are organizations that work to do that simultaneously, and that's what I would think would make the most sense in that case, is that you would want the humans and the pet to leave at the same time. Just in my head, that would be what my concern would be. If you take the pet out, unless you have a very good excuse and the perpetrator buys it, it's going to be a tip off. If the pet leaves today and the humans leave tomorrow, what's going to happen in that time? I would be very worried about. I would think that it would need to be a simultaneous departure, and that's what some of these shelters do, is that even if they can't house the pet on site, you bring them with you, and we'll get them from here to where they're safe.
That's great information. We have 2 questions in the Q&A that I'd like to address in the time that we have left. The first one goes back to the maps that you were showing and asks, were the animal incidents tied to the domestic violence cases on those maps, or were the animal incidents independent of the domestic violence cases?
Independent, totally separate data sources, not connected. And when I say animal incidents, I'm looking at abuse and cruelty. I also include strays and bites, because while some pets get loose just because you forgot to lock a gate, others get loose because they haven't been fed in a long period of time. Some animals just bite in the moment because they're scared, reacting. Other animals bite because they're in a harmful environment. Either they're experiencing the abuse themselves or absorbing the fear and abuse of those they live with. And so I actually see predictive value, and I just provided a sample today. And anytime I'm doing these reports, I just use those dots pulled back because obviously I want my work to always be helpful, and I never want to risk revealing households or things such as that. But I have much more information than what I share in this public context. But yeah, these are separate data sources that, even controlling for population, that we still see this pretty significant spatial overlap. I actually have several other communities. I think I've done it now in probably closer to 11 communities. So much more than what I shared, and seeing this similar overlap, which I think can be quite compelling. Again, just even looking at it from that aspect, these are totally different data sources, but again, we're seeing these same responses in these same areas. And I do have data too to show that it's not just the same area, but in the same homes many of the time. But again, I try to protect that and be mindful of victims, and that's why you see those dots pulled back. But yeah, they are separate data sources, and there's some compelling overlap in a wide range of communities that I looked at so far, and not just in Indiana. I've looked in other states as well.
Your personal story and the data that you've given us have really, enveloped a lot of thought processes going on with a lot of us. And one of our attendees wants to know, what are the keys for how you are successfully dealing with your own trauma?
It's not been easy. I'll be honest. I struggled particularly at first. My first work, like I said, I left my house and I went into pretty deep depression. It sounds backwards. When I left, my sister had just gotten married. My mom was doing well. It felt like success, after all that time, and I made that promise, and they both are not just because of me, obviously they've worked through all kinds of things and have done incredible things. But leaving that house, I just was so used to that I immediately went into depression. I had lost my dog just prior to that. And that day I lost him, I mean, it literally felt like a piece of my soul had been wrenched from me. I don't know how else to describe it. And that's the other important thing we need to think about. I didn't have time to get to it today, but pets are often so important to these families when they lose them. And even if it's not from an abuser, but just from natural causes, you know, my dog died at 17. They become so dependent on them when they lose them. You know, then there's great risk there too. And so I really struggled. For me, I think finding a way to channel it. And so this is a way that I've channeled it. The talking is hard though. I do a lot of writing. Writing has been therapeutic for me. Talking is hard because I relive it. So I've pretty much wiped out the rest of the day. Anytime I'm going to public speak, or whether it's in person or virtual on these issues, I know that it always activates my stress response, and it comes at a price. So the rest of my day is pretty much shot. I know that after I give these things, it causes a reliving of that trauma. But for me, it was finding a way to turn it and to use it for good. For so long, I felt so helpless. And then you know, as I said, even when I started my work, I wasn't talking about my own victimization, but I found healing and using that pain. And it doesn't mean that I look back and say, oh, all that pain was worth it. But I'm thankful for the opportunity to use that pain because we know we learn a lot from books and the knowledge is important, but it's the insight that really comes from the experience. And so combining the two has allowed me to be successful and given me some healing in the idea of using that pain that I experienced to try to keep others from it or to help others who are dealing with it.
Thank you very much for answering our questions, sharing your story. You'll be sharing your PowerPoint with us along with all those resources. We've had lots of great comments come in. I'm very excited to be able to record this, to have it up for others to watch in the future. Many people are like, I can't wait to forward this on. We will have this up probably in the next week. So those of you that are participating and want to refer this on to others, give us about a week to get that up on the animal facilities site. So again, thank you very much. Andrew, with that, Ben, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you again for presenting for us today, Mr. Campbell. And thank you to all of our participants that joined today. The next webinar in our virtual small animal series will be Tuesday, June 15th at 12 p.m. with Mr. York from the Kansas Department of Revenue on taxes and 501c3 information. Thank you.